Twice, the largest empire the world had ever seen sent a fleet to erase Japan. Twice, on the eve of its fall, the wind rose out of nowhere and swallowed that fleet whole. The second time, nearly 140,000 men were coming for the islands. It remained the largest seaborne invasion in human history until the beaches of Normandy, almost 7 centuries later. You have heard the ending, a divine wind, a miracle, ships shattered on the rocks while a nation prayed. It is one of the most famous stories Japan ever told about itself, and the wind is the smallest part of what actually happened. You are standing on a beach at Hakata Bay. It is the autumn of 1274. The sky over the water has gone the color of a bruise. Then you see the sails, not 10, not 50, hundreds of them, crowding the horizon until the sea looks like it has grown a forest overnight. They have crossed from the mainland, from a realm that stretches from Korea to the edge of Europe, and every prow is pointed at the ground beneath your feet. For 6 years, letters had been arriving. They came from Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of the largest land empire that has ever existed. The wording was polite. The meaning was not. Submit and become a vassal. Refuse and be destroyed.
The letters called Japan a small country and advised it to think carefully. In Kamakura, the man who read them was barely more than a boy. His name was Hōjō Tokimune. He held the title of Shikken, the regent who ruled in the shadow of a powerless shogun, who in turn ruled in the shadow of a powerless emperor. Japan in the 13th century was a country governed by warriors, and the warriors answered to him. He was 18 years old when the first envoys came. He sent them home with no answer at all. Later, when Kublai's patience ran out and new envoys arrived on Japanese soil, Tokimune had them behead. Think about that choice. He was refusing the demand of an empire that had already crushed the Song dynasty of China, that had burned Baghdad, that had ridden to the gates of Vienna. Every kingdom that had received a letter like his and answered with defiance was gone. What did a scattering of islands at the far edge of the world have that all of them had lacked? The answer was not the wind, not yet. The fleet at Hakata Bay in 1274 carried perhaps 23,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers. They came ashore and they fought in a way the Japanese had never seen. The samurai of that age fought as individuals. A warrior would ride forward, announce his name and his lineage in a loud voice, and challenge a worthy opponent to single combat. It was warfare as ritual, as honor, as a kind of terrible theater. The Mongols did not care about your name. They fought in disciplined blocks, thousands moving as one body, raining arrows in coordinated volleys. They used exploding iron bombs, launched from catapults, that burst with fire and noise no one on those beaches had ever imagined. The samurai were being butchered by an entirely different idea of what a battle was. By the end of the day, the defenders had pulled back. The invaders held the shore. Night fell over Hakata Bay, and every man who had survived knew that in the morning the killing would begin again, and it would not stop. But in the morning, the ships were gone. A storm had come in the dark. When the sun rose, the fleet had withdrawn to open water and turned for home, and much of it never arrived. Some accounts say hundreds of ships went down. To the people standing on that beach, it could only mean one thing. The gods themselves had reached into the sea and pulled the enemy under. Here, you have to be honest about what the record shows. Historians still argue over the storm of 1274. Some of the sources that describe it were written long after the fact.
It is possible the Mongols withdrew because they had always meant to, because it was a reconnaissance in force rather than a full conquest, because they had run low of arrows after a single brutal day. The miracle may have been smaller than the legend. Keep that in your mind, because Japan did not wait around to find out. Hōjō Tokimune did not thank the gods and go back to sleep. He looked at Hakata Bay, the wide, flat beach that had let the enemy walk straight into his country, and he decided to close it. Along roughly 20 kilometers of coastline, his warriors and laborers raised a wall of stone.
2 meters high, 2 meters thick, sloped on the seaward side so that a horse could not climb it, and a landing party would break against it. They built it without cement, fitting the stones by hand, and they finished the most vital stretches in a matter of months. They also organized rotating coast guards, a standing watch of samurai who would never again be caught flat-footed on an open shore. They were not preparing to be saved. They were preparing to save themselves. Because everyone knew the letters would come again. And they did. In 1281, Kublai Khan launched the largest naval invasion the world had ever seen. Not one fleet, but two. One sailed from Korea. A second, vastly larger, sailed from the newly conquered south of China.
Together, they carried something on the order of 4,000 ships and as many as 140,000 men. It was a number that should not have been possible in that century. Nothing on that scale would be attempted again by sea for 660 years. And this time, when they reached Hakata Bay, the beach was a wall. The samurai were waiting behind their stone barrier, and everything they had learned in 1274, they now turned against the enemy. They could not be lured into single combat, so they stopped offering it. At night, small boats slipped out from the coast, filled with warriors who boarded the anchored Mongol ships in the dark, killed the crews, and vanished before dawn. One of those warriors was a man named Takezaki Suenaga, and we know his story in astonishing detail because he commissioned a set of illustrated scrolls, the Mongol Shodai Ekotoba, to record what he did and to prove he deserved a reward. In those paintings you can still see him, bleeding, his horse struck by an arrow, riding straight at the invaders. It is one of the oldest eyewitness war records in the world, and it does not describe a nation waiting to be rescued. It describes men fighting for their lives and winning time. For weeks, the invaders could not break through. They could not force a landing in strength. They were held offshore, crowded onto their ships in the heat of a Japanese summer, tied together deck to deck so tightly that a man could walk from one vessel to the next. Their supplies were rotting, their soldiers were sick, and out over the Pacific, in the middle of August, the season was turning. You know what is coming. You have known since the first line. And here, at last, is where the wind belongs. The typhoon struck the anchored fleet in late August of 1281. The ships that had been lashed together for safety became a single vast target, grinding and splintering against one another as the sea rose. Vessels built quickly in Chinese shipyards, some of them riverboats never meant for open ocean, came apart in the waves. Modern archaeologists working the seabed off Takashima have pulled up the wreckage, anchors and shattered hulls, and the scattered bones of that armada, and the evidence agrees with the chronicles. The larger fleet was destroyed, tens of thousands drowned. The survivors who made it ashore were hunted down. Of the 140,000 who had come, only a fraction ever saw home again. The Japanese gave that wind a name, Kamikaze, the divine wind.
And they believed with total conviction that the gods of Japan had struck down the greatest army on earth to protect a sacred land that could never be conquered. But look closely at what really happened, because the wind arrived at a country that had already refused to lose. If Hōjō Tokimune had bowed to the letters, there would have been no war for the storm to end. If the wall had not been built, the invaders would have been ashore and inland long before August. If the samurai had not fought them to a standstill on the water for weeks, the fleet would not have been sitting exactly where the typhoon found it. The wind did not save a passive people. It finished a fight that a defiant people had already refused to lose. Some modern historians, looking hard at the sources, argue the defenders mattered more than the weather ever did. The storm was real. So were the men who made the storm matter. And this is the part that should stay with you, because that beautiful, dangerous idea did not die in the 13th century. The belief that Japan was divinely protected, that a sacred wind would always rise to save it in the hour of ruin, sank deep into the country's sense of itself. 6.5 centuries later, in the final year of the Second World War, a nation facing invasion once more reached back for that story.
Young pilots were sent to crash their aircraft into enemy ships, a last human wind flung against an overwhelming fleet. They were called Kamikaze. The name was taken directly from those 13th century storms. This time, there was no miracle, and the young men died for a myth that the original defenders would not have recognized, because the samurai at Hakata Bay never sat and waited for heaven. They built a wall. So here is the question worth carrying out of this. When the story of the two storms gets told, who is the hero? The wind that came from the gods? Or the 18-year-old who said no, and the warriors who spent 7 years making sure that when the wind finally came, it would have something left to finish? Go to Fukuoka today, and you can still find it. Long stretches of that stone wall survive, worn and half buried among the modern streets, the barrier that turned an open beach into a fortress. Tourists walk past it without a glance. It does not look like much, just old stones, fitted together by hand, facing an empty sea. But twice the largest empire the world had ever seen sent a fleet to erase Japan, and the reason there was still a country standing when the wind arrived was not written in the sky. It was set, stone by stone, into the ground beneath your feet.